Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Nicaragua webinar entitled Sanctions, the Threat and the Promise for Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'm one of your co-moderators today, along with Nan McCurdy, who will participate in the question and answer period. And now we turn to today's program. We'll hear from 4 speakers, followed by a question and answer period. Please do keep entering your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. Our first speaker is Jill Clark-Gollub, who is the coordinator of the Americas Without Sanctions campaign, which is a project of Sanctions Kill. She's also on the coordinating committee of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and is a member of Friends of Latin America and the Venezuela Solidarity Network. Welcome, Jill. You have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. As I speak, I'm going to show some slides so that people can get a feel for the campaign that we ran in December, starting in November. I hope everyone can see my slides. So the Americas Without Sanctions campaign of Sanctions Kill organized a campaign around Human Rights Day, December 10th. And this project brought together the solidarity movements represented here today for Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, as well as new partners, and exposed the hypocrisy of U.S. narratives on human rights. The cornerstone event, How Sanctions Violate Human Rights in Palestine, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, was hosted at the historic Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, where we were welcomed home by Pastor William Lamar. Since this was just after the fall of the Syrian government, Sanctions Kill chairperson Sarah Flounders pointed out how U.S. sanctions, coupled with disinformation and military violence, are used to bring down governments that refuse to submit to U.S. control, causing much suffering for the people who live in those countries. Austin Cole of the Black Alliance for Peace and Zone of Peace campaign told of the earliest sanctions in the Americas, those imposed on Haiti, and stressed that it is important to defend countries like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela that are exercising their sovereignty and achieving the same rights, such as healthcare, education, and housing, that people in the United States are demanding. The keynote speaker of the evening was Ayad Kishawi, a Palestinian member of the International People's Tribunal on U.S. Imperialism, which held 15 country hearings in 2023. He spoke of the deaths caused in Palestine by blockades and sanctions before the current war, and how sanctions on over 40 countries have become a new form of genocide, making it difficult for people to obtain medicines and medical supplies, food, and clean water. Not only are these economic coercive measures illegal and inherently violent, they are designed to maintain economic inequality, continue the theft of wealth from the global South, and preserve racial hierarchy in the international system, which he illustrated with examples of U.S. hybrid warfare on Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. Alejandro Garcia del Toro of the Cuban Embassy, Ambassador Lautaro Sandino of Nicaragua, and Carlos Ron, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Venezuela, all spoke about the people-centered human rights that their governments uphold, while U.S.-imposed economic coercive measures seek to deny entire populations the right to development. Despite these measures, these countries are leaders in upholding the human rights to healthcare, education, housing, food, clean water, and the rights of women, indigenous people, and Afro-descendants. The final speaker was Dr. Samira Adri of Friends of Latin America and a graduate of the Latin American School of Medicine. She called out the international human rights system for remaining silent while entire populations are denied their rights due to U.S. sanctions. And she urged the audience to stand firmly in solidarity with Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Palestine as we work to build a better world. We were also fortunate to have the photo exhibit of Doctors Against Genocide put together by Palestinian medical professionals on display during the event. On December 11th, around 14 volunteers, including Code Pink citizen lobbyists, delivered the Americas Without Sanctions petition to Congress, calling upon the U.S. government to end its economic sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. This included a contingent of New Jersey constituents who traveled to Washington to lobby. There are plans to follow up with multiple legislators. And by the way, many of these same volunteers also attended Marco Rubio's Senate confirmation hearing on January 15th to protest his role in pushing harmful U.S. sanctions. In addition to the 1,000 who viewed the December 10th forum live, hundreds more listened live on WPFW radio and have viewed the recordings on YouTube. The Week of Actions for Human Rights Day greatly expanded Sanctions Kill's social media presence, including some valuable infographics. And we encourage you to follow and share our posts on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at the addresses that will be posted in the chat. There was also a progressive media component, including coverage in outlets such as Clearing the Fog, Kausachun News, Voices with Vision, What's at Stake, WPFW radio spots, Voices of Resistance on WBAI, Honduran Television, Venezuela Viva, and others. We look forward to building on this success in the rocky times ahead as we uphold Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela as examples of the people-centered human rights we need everywhere, and to push back against the false narratives aimed at regime change. Thank you.
Nan, you're muted.
Sorry, everyone. It's so nice to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you for taking the time. And thanks, Jill. That was a great presentation. Our next speaker is Jennifer Atlee. Jennifer worked for 3 decades in Central America in the areas of human rights, trauma and recovery, and international policy. She worked with Witness for Peace, the Guatemalan Church in Exile, Nicaraguan Ministry of Social Welfare, and was a regional representative for the Quaker organization American Friends Service Committee. She is the author of Red Thread, a spiritual journey of accompaniment, trauma, and healing, which chronicles her experiences in the war zones of Nicaragua during the US-sponsored Contra War under Ronald Reagan. Currently, she works with the Friendship Office, focusing on the impact of US policy in Honduras and Nicaragua. Jenny, you have the floor.
Hey, thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you to the organizers and the co-panelists. I wanted to just start talking about, as I was preparing for this, just reflecting about how just a few years ago, all of that work that Jill just described, the rich intersectionality and solidarity that went into all of that work, it wasn't even possible. We didn't have that in place. It wasn't even possible hardly to talk about Nicaragua, nor in Congress or even in some coalition spaces. And that dominant narrative that had been put forward to demonize Nicaragua was so strong and so prevalent and unchallenged that it was really difficult. Nicaragua was sort of isolated as a pariah. And if you did try to talk about Nicaragua, you would be, ability was undermined. And it even became, to talk about Nicaragua, you were seen as a liability to others that were working on other issues. So it was a very difficult situation. And then thinking back, what I'm aware of is that sort of right prior to the 2021 election in Nicaragua, something started to shift. And for me, looking back, it was really 2 things. in terms of this work that has developed around advocacy. One was something very unusual. A staffer that had a congressional staffer with a pretty high position with the House Foreign Relations Committee reached out to us, contacted us, which is unusual, and said that they were very concerned about what was happening in terms of Nicaragua in the run-up to the elections, and said that there was already a letter circulating in Congress prior to the elections even happening. And the text of the letter was being circulated and it was collecting signatures. And this letter already determined that the elections were fraudulent and calling for sanctions, increased sanctions. And so the staffer said, we need to hear from people who have experience in Nicaragua. And can you generate pushback? We need pushback. And if you can generate some people with experience and facts-based information, we'll make sure it gets looked at. So that was one thing that happened. The other thing that happened, looking back, was that a couple sign-on letters started happening. They were sign-on letters to collect signatures that was going to be a letter to members of Congress. And one of them was from former people who had been solidarity workers in the 1980s in Nicaragua, and another one was members of the religious community. And these letters were denouncing Nicaragua, very critical, right in the run-up to those elections. And everyone's entitled to their opinion, but the timing of those letters was so linked to the destabilization efforts and regime change efforts and calls for sanctions that we felt that we also needed to speak up, that other voices needed to be heard. And so that's when we generated our first sort of advocacy effort, which was it was the Stop Interfering letter. And we made a statement, stop interfering. And we documented how this interference was happening. And it was put out right on the anniversary of the decision at The Hague that had upheld Nicaragua's case against the United States during the Contra War for its intervention and war crimes. So that letter was a test. We didn't know where things were. That dominant narrative was sort of raging and had all the airspace, but we put out this statement, and very quickly we got over 200 organizational signers from organizations all around the world. And that we used that letter to start organizing that group of organizations, and we leveraged that into advocacy to stop legislation, which for sanctions, which at that point was the Renacer Act. So that was sort of a big shifting point that happened right there in 2021. And then with a lot of Jill's work, who's on the call today and who gave the first presentation, who was very instrumental, and others, we started to build coalition. We realized it was key to get Nicaragua out of this position of isolation, and that its shared experience of the impact of sanctions with Venezuela and Cuba and other countries was really important to make those connections. And in making those connections, we were able to increase and expand the coordination and solidarity work with other organizations, and expand and increase the education and organization within our own network. Just building capacity to understand sanctions, how they work, what they are, what they do. And then that could translate into resources that we put together, toolkits, messaging, actions. Then as the war in Gaza was raging on, and Nicaragua took its expertise in winning its case against the United States to the International Court of Justice on behalf of Palestine, then the US retaliated with sanctions, with some new sanctions. And so then that opened up streams of communication and solidarity with Palestinian networks. So that sort of built a whole new layer into this networking. One other thing that I think has been really important is the work of Alfred Zayas, who was brought to our attention, a UN expert and professor of international human rights law. And he has written a lot about sanctions as a violation of international law and human rights. And then people within our network, John Perry, thank you for all your work that you've done to lift that up and keep giving it to us in new ways. And that has really helped us to shift the narrative away from sort of weaponizing human rights against Nicaragua to refocusing on US policy and how it violates human rights. So that's been a big part of that advocacy work and growth. So then we formed our own advocacy committee. We realized we were doing enough of this that we needed to have a group that was dedicated to that. So we have an advocacy committee now within the Nicaragua Solidarity Committee. Just want to say, in terms of advocacy, we have no illusion that changing US, that social change is going to come via the US Congress. But we do feel that there's a responsibility to push back against this interventionist policy and policies of our government that do harm. And that we do this advocacy always in the context of education, organizing, and solidarity building, not as an isolated activity. One other thing is the Honduras Solidarity Network also has become very interested and is watching closely this work of Americas Without Sanctions and the work on sanctions, because there is an election coming up in this year in Honduras. There are destabilization efforts afoot there, and sanctions may become an issue for Honduras as well. And so there's a lot of interest also on the part of our partners in Honduras in terms of this work. So what we have focused on is one is identifying allies in Congress and also people on key committees, and identifying things that legislation that we definitely want a no to, and to vote no or obstruct the process or slow the process down. And so those are the legislation to apply more sanctions to Nicaragua. There's a Senate bill and a companion bill in the House. So we've been urging people to vote no to those. Those bills are a priority of Rubio, so we can expect that to be accelerated probably in this new administration. And then we also are identifying things that we want people to vote yes to and to support. So we want to say no to this, but we also want to say yes to this. And there are some initiatives, some policies that we do want people to support. And those initiatives have really come up, are the result of grassroots, bottom-up advocacy work over many, many years that eventually show up in the form of proposed legislation. And those are a resolution by Representative Velasquez from New York, HR 943, that calls for the annulment of the Monroe Doctrine. And within that bill specifically, there is a request. One of the asks is to eliminate sanctions. So that's one piece we say yes to, and urge people to support that, to urge their representatives to co-sponsor and to do education about that. The other resource in terms of policy is another resolution introduced by Representative Casar from Texas, HR 1525, and it's a resolution for migration stability. And in that resolution, U.S. policy in the region is identified as a root cause of forced displacement and migration as a driving factor for waves of migration. And it also calls specifically for the elimination of sanctions. So those are two resources that we have that we can support. And also with both of those pieces of legislation, both of those resolutions, there are cohorts of co-sponsors that are co-sponsoring both of them, that are allies, a potential group of allies that we can work with, that understand us, that understand the impact of sanctions. And so that's an area that we want to deepen those relationships. And so then one other advocacy space that has existed for a couple of years in Washington works around policy work specific to Mesoamerica. Several of the solidarity organizations around Salvador, Honduras are in that space. CPUSA, which is a think tank that has done a lot of work on sanctions, is also in that space. And it has been their practice that each time there is a new administration that comes into office, that the coalition kind of drafts a policy framework or a set of recommendations to that new administration, and has a participatory process to basically invite input and content into that document. And it is often a very helpful document, both to allies in Congress and to our own bases in terms of just really coming up with a policy framework that we want to see. So that letter was done to Biden when he won 4 years ago. When he came into office, that policy statement was prepared, and it was signed by over 100 different organizations, AFDJ included, which used to host the Nicaragua network, signed that letter. And we were revisiting doing one again. And the consensus at this point is that, frankly, no one has the heart to write to this administration, so there will be no letter to the current president, but that it does make sense to draft a policy statement, what we want to see and what we are most concerned about, and to direct it towards allies in Congress, and to also serve both reflect input from our networks and feedback to our networks as a tool. And that will be an opportunity also to include language about sanctions. So that is something that's in process. We'll be developing over the next few months. The other thing we're just keeping an eye on is this legislation, HR 9495, which is called the Stop Terror Financing Bill. It came up in December, and there was a near miss, but right now it was not passed. It was passed and then not passed. So it's not effective right now, but basically that bill gives Treasury Department, US Treasury, the authority to take away 501c3 status from any organization without evidence that it considers to be supporting a country on the state sponsors of terrorist list, or supporting terror. And that is not just linked to financing. It also includes speech or advocacy. So we are keeping an eye on that bill. And then just to close, I have Rubio as Secretary of State. His first trip is to Central America. So we see the priority, and we're very concerned about what US policy is going to look like towards the region. And we talked about threat and promise as the title of this webinar. And I think that our promise is to really keep stepping up in terms of our responsibility to address U.S. policy in all the ways we can, to keep organizing and to keep building this robust solidarity throughout the region. And it's just, I'm so grateful to be here today with Leonardo and Onyesonwu, and to be able to not be here alone as Nicaragua, to be here with you, and to lift up your struggles and work in Venezuela and Cuba, and to have you all also hold Nicaragua in your work and in your struggle. So I'll end there and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Our next speaker is Leonardo Flores. He is a Venezuelan political analyst and activist with close ties to social movements. He previously worked as the senior policy advisor at the Venezuelan embassy in Washington and is currently an organizer with Code Pink. Leonardo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nan. Not currently an organizer with Code Pink, previously, just to
Okay.
clear that up. But thank you, Nan. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the Nicaragua Solidarity Network, Solidarity Coalition, for the invitation. I thought I might take a little different track because, I think Venezuela might be facing a slightly different scenario than Cuba or Nicaragua as we see what the Trump administration is going to do. Because as we know, there's still an ongoing attempted coup in Venezuela, and now there are new threats of an invasion. In the days after the presidential elections in July of this past year, there were 28 people who were killed, including the targeted murders of two Chavista women local community leaders. And this was basically right-wing fascist violence carried out by paramilitary groups and armed thugs, for the most part, that were trying to cause a violent reaction from the government. And when they were captured, they claimed that they were paid and organized by the opposition. I mean, they attacked schools and universities and healthcare centers, the housing ministry, the National Electoral Council, buses, metro stations, even a zoo. I mean, it was just a widespread attack against anything that looked Chavista or revolutionary in Venezuela, similar to what Venezuela had already faced in 2014 and 2017, to what Nicaragua faced in 2018, and to a lesser extent to what Cuba faced in 2021. Within a week, though, the country was back to normal, in part because I think it's become pretty clear that the Venezuelan people are really sick, not just of sanctions, but of these attempted coups and the violence that the fascist right wing is trying to impose upon the country. But this didn't really stop the threats, because we had mercenary kingpin Eric Prince. If y'all don't remember Eric Prince, he's the brother of Betsy DeVos. He's a Trump ally, and he was the co-founder of Blackwater, a mercenary group. And in September, he started this weird kind of crowdsourcing fund to try to overthrow the Venezuelan government. It eventually all fell apart, and there were accusations of fraud within this group that was trying to raise these funds. But really, what it pointed to was that were horrible things that were being planned for Venezuela. 150 foreigners have been arrested since August. And when I mean foreigners, I'm not talking about tourists. I'm talking about mercenaries, former and active duty military, people with ties to US and European intelligence agencies and police agencies. And they were accused of, among other things, plotting to blow up infrastructure and assassinate key leaders. 10 of these are US citizens, including one who was an active duty member of the Navy. There's been hundreds of weapons seized and explosives seized. They were really trying to overthrow the government prior to the January 10th inauguration of President Maduro, and apparently, most of it was snuffed out, of course. But it led to former Colombian President Álvaro Uribe making this wild declaration calling for a military intervention, which was then echoed by Argentina's President Javier Milei and Venezuelan fascists like Leopoldo López. And then a couple of days later, we saw a really horrible op-ed in the New York Times by, I think it was Bret Stephens, who called for a coup against President Maduro and using force if necessary. So in that regard, I think Venezuela still remains in the crosshairs, of course, of the Trump administration, as it was under the Biden administration. And speaking of the Biden administration and sanctions and what Venezuela went through over these past 4 years, it's pretty clear to all of us that Biden was horrible on all three of the countries that we're speaking about today in kind of slightly different ways. And that said, though, while Biden kept all of these Trump sanctions in place, except for at the last minute against Cuba, it wasn't exactly maximum pressure because the Trump administration placed over 900 sanctions on Venezuela. And when I worked at the embassy in 2017, 2019, we would jokingly say that Fridays were sanctions Fridays because every single Friday there was new press release issued by OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, Department of Treasury, listing a new sanction on Venezuela. And though Biden briefly lifted some of these sanctions, he eventually basically reimposed all of them except for allowing new oil licenses. And that was less to do about Venezuela and more to do about the fact that Europe was undergoing a severe energy crunch due to the sanctions on Russia and the war on Ukraine. But now that we have, Trump and Marco Rubio, who was the architect of that maximum pressure strategy, we're going to see most likely a similar approach towards Venezuela, but its impact may be limited because Venezuela has changed significantly in the past 8 years since Trump first came into office. So the first time around when the sanctions were imposed, oil production collapsed and the government lost 99% of its revenue. It led to a crisis in healthcare, hyperinflation, food scarcity. But right now, Venezuela has had 3 straight years of economic growth, 15% in 2022, 5.5% in 2023, and over 9% last year, 2024. Venezuela went from importing 80+% of its food to now producing 100% of the food that it consumes. So Venezuela is now food sovereign, which has been, a huge achievement and something that's Venezuela's been talking about for decades, and they finally managed to achieve it. And there's a program called the PLAP program that provides discounted and free food, and it reaches millions of families every month. So Venezuela has a bit of more of a safeguard going into this Trump administration than it did the first time around. And the point isn't that the new sanctions aren't going to hurt Venezuela, but that Venezuela is in a much stronger position to mitigate their impacts. In fact, there was a recent report by an opposition economist. His name is Francisco Rodriguez. He estimates that lifting sanctions entirely on Venezuela would lead to 18% GDP growth over the next 5 years and would reverse migration, while returning to maximum pressure is going to lead to economic contraction and another 1 million people leaving Venezuela. And it's curious to me, that this issue of migration in Venezuela, we didn't really talk about Venezuelan migration during the Trump administration. And that's because those sanctions came on so fast and so hard that it was really almost very difficult for an average Venezuelan to leave Venezuela to go to the United States. So most of them went to other countries in Latin America, Ecuador, Colombia, Peru, among others. And then once Venezuela began to recover and people started being able to save money, that's when we saw this kind of flow of migrants up north to the United States. Because we have to remember that migrating by land costs a lot of money. I read an article just pretty recently, about a month ago, where they estimated the cost from Guatemala for a migrant to be about $10,000. And Guatemala is about halfway to the US border from Venezuela. So imagine how much more it's going to cost a Venezuelan migrant to migrate by land. When we look at the sanctions as well, one of the key pieces of legislation that the right has been trying to impose here in Congress has been the Bolivar Act, which would basically codify sanctions on Venezuela. It passed the House unanimously in the fall of 2024. It hasn't been reintroduced yet, but I'm almost positive it will be reintroduced again. That said, I think there's also some interesting things going on in terms of within the Trump administration, because there's 2 factions right now. Obviously, on the one hand, you have Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State and how he was the architect before of the strategy. But Trump has also named a loyalist. He named Richard Grenell to be the special envoy to Venezuela and North Korea. And if we remember, in his first term, Trump famously met with Kim Jong-un and had this kind of opening towards North Korea. And actually, Grenell, at the end of the first Trump administration, he was in contact with the Venezuelan government and trying to engage in dialogue, because at that point, it seemed as though Trump had kind of soured on this idea of Juan Guaido and the sanctions and wanted to pursue a new path. So clearly, I think these 2 kind of factions within the White House are poised to clash at some point. It's unclear who's going to come out on top, but it is clear that Rubio starts from the stronger position because he controls the State Department now. And then Barbara asked me to focus on how we can collaborate more effectively across organizations and countries to confront the challenges of sanctions and other coercive measures. And I was thinking about that a lot. And the first thing I wanted to say, and I think Jennifer touched on this quite a bit, is that I think we have to really recognize the work that we've all been doing over the past years and the impact it's had. Jennifer mentioned the Casar bill and the Velasquez bill. Also in 2020, Ilhan Omar had a bill about congressional oversight. I don't think she reintroduced it again, but I think that's a good pressure point, is to push her to reintroduce this bill that would impose congressional oversight over sanctions to ensure that they weren't violating human rights. And of course, we've also seen a push in Congress due to grassroots efforts about linking migration to sanctions and about how sanctions are a driving force of migration, right? On top of that, there was a series of articles last year in the Washington Post. I want to say there was maybe 7 articles total, but I might be wrong about the number. But all of them focused on how sanctions are having negative effects in different ways. It might not have been the exact framing that we would have wanted had we written the articles ourselves, but it does point to the fact that I think we've been able to change the discourse on sanctions and to really start to focus on the impact of sanctions on people rather than just whatever the geopolitical goals of the new sanctions regime may be. And so I think it's really important that the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition, the National Network on Cuba, and the Venezuela Solidarity Network can continue to do their country-specific work while also supporting some of these broader projects like Americans Without Sanctions and Sanctions Kill, because I think it's been an effective strategy. Jennifer was totally right in terms of Nicaragua and how it was very toxic to even talk about it, because, and I say that because it was the same sort of thing for Venezuela. And so in some cases, it makes sense to talk about our countries individually, but I think it also makes a lot of sense to unite all 3 issues because, first of all 3 countries are united themselves, and it makes sense that as solidarity activists, we follow the lead of the people that we're fighting for in that regard. And I think, we're going to have a very challenging time with Rubio in the State Department, but I think we also should recognize that it's highly unlikely that he's going to be there for all 4 years. So that we should really understand that while he's there, it might be next to impossible to get anything substantial done in Congress. But I think that's why we should continue to focus our work on the political education, like the webinars that all 3 organizations are having on a regular basis, and political education in terms of educating our members of Congress and their staffers to the extent that we can. And in terms of a concrete idea, maybe it's not the space to propose it, but I think we should maybe consider having kind of joint thematic webinars every 3 or 4 months, talking about the impacts of sanctions on, say, women or health or labor, with a speaker from each country, and to unite our 3 movements together, maybe under the banner of Americans Without Sanctions, to really solidify the message that sanctions harm people at the very most basic level, and that they're pushing people out in terms of migration. Because that issue of sanctions as a driver of migration, it has bipartisan appeal, and it actually might appeal in particular to some of these MAGA elected officials who don't see U.S. intervention in the same way that a neocon like Marco Rubio does. And then one last kind of idea is really to try to identify folks in the diaspora who have good positions on sanctions. I think you all might be familiar with Fuentes de Amor, who led by Cuban Americans, and they've done a really good job in this regard of having Cuban American voices talk about the negative impacts on sanctions. And it would be great to find similar groups or to form similar groups for Nicaraguans and Venezuelans as well. And lastly, during the first Trump administration, it wasn't just sanctions that were the issue. Of course, we had the coup in Bolivia, we had U.S. interference, just as we've always had. And, it wasn't anything special to the Trump administration. But this time around, he's been making threats against Panama in terms of military intervention, Mexico in terms of military intervention. So I think we really need to maintain a sort of flexibility in terms of not just necessarily focusing on sanctions, but becoming part of a broader Latin American solidarity movement to encompass all of these issues, all of these countries that are going to be targeted by the Trump administration. And just before the webinar started, we were talking about how Trump is now threatening sanctions on Colombia because President Petro in Colombia has decided to ban these deportation flights. And this stems from the fact that there was a deportation flight to Brazil where upon leaving the plane, we saw that the people who were being deported were in handcuffs. So it's a total criminalization of migrants that we're seeing. And people and presidents in Latin America are saying no, including Gustavo Petro and including Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico. And so now Colombia is under threat of sanctions. I think the very latest that I saw a few minutes ago was that Petro is offering to send his own presidential plane to return some migrants and to engage in talks with the United States. But this does have the chance to become a much broader issue than just our three countries, because it does seem like, sanctions are going to be wielded as this broad weapon against any sort of policy that the United States doesn't like. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo.
Yes, thank you, Leonardo. You brought up a lot of new good ideas that we could consider in collaboration with one another. Our final speaker is Onyesonwu Chatoyer, who describes herself as an African woman marooned in the United States, organizing to defeat capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism. She's an organizer with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and the All-African Women's Revolutionary Union. She is also an editor with Hood Communist, a co-chair of the National Network on Cuba, and an organizer with the Venceremos Brigade. Onyesonwu, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. I am grateful to be able to share space with y'all. I want to start off by reading a statement that the National Network on Cuba and the Venceremos Brigade are going to release about the Trump administration's provocations against Cuba. And then I want to move into some what is to be done. So, on the evening of Monday, January 20th, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump signed a sweeping executive order which revoked all executive orders issued by the Biden administration. Among the revoked orders was Biden's 11th hour removal of Cuba from the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. We recognize this action by the Trump administration as part of a long history of U.S.-sponsored counter-revolutionary efforts targeting the Cuban people and an intensification of the U.S. government's war on Cuba. We also recognize that the Biden administration, by waiting until the last minute to issue an order that they knew would almost certainly be rescinded, robbed Cuba of the time needed to gather the resources required to address a profound economic crisis created by the United States. The U.S. government has a long bipartisan history of callously toying with the lives of Cuban people, and this is yet another disgusting example. In 1969, the oldest Cuba Solidarity Brigade in the U.S. was founded just 10 years after the time of the Cuban Revolution, at a time when it was only possible to travel to Cuba from the United States through extra-legal means. Those who volunteered on that first brigade did so in response to the United States launching a war against Cuba, a war designed to destabilize the country, create mass suffering, and build the conditions necessary for the overthrow of the revolutionary socialist government. The first brigadistas of the Venceremos Brigade recognized that the only so-called crime that the people of Cuba had committed against the United States was breaking free from the colonial status imposed upon their island for more than a century. It was within this context that the First Brigade and the U.S. Cuba Solidarity Movement was started, so that those of us in the belly of the beast could play our role in building solidarity with Cuba and ending the U.S. war against the Cuban people. The centerpiece of the U.S. government's war on Cuba, the economic blockade, is explicitly designed to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government, and that is, of course, quoting from the famous Lester D. Mallory memo of 1960, by cutting Cuba off from international banking and trade. Not only does the blockade prevent trade between the U.S. and Cuba, but it has also proven to be a successful deterrent against other countries doing business with Cuba for fear of being blackballed by the U.S. The impact of this economic isolation on the day-to-day lives of Cuban people is profound. It means widespread shortages of food, fuel, and medicine, nationwide blackouts, crumbling infrastructure that cannot be repaired because they cannot import the materials to do so, mass migration, and death. Alongside this policy of economic strangulation, the U.S. government has pursued a military policy of sustained terror against civilians. This has included the funding of terrorists to sabotage and destroy resource centers in Cuba, the bombing of roads and ports, the bombing of commercial airlines with Cuban nationals on them, the attempted assassinations of leaders, and the murder of revolutionary teachers as young as 15 who volunteered to go into the countryside to teach Cubans to read. Cuba has long been a beacon and a leader in the global movement for liberation that is challenging U.S. hegemony. Cuba's practice of internationalism, which has ranged from aiding movements for liberation in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, to the training of doctors and teachers throughout the world, including in the United States, has always been seen as a threat. It is for this simple reason, and with the absence of any evidence, that the US government continues its projection of its own crimes onto Cuba with its absurd designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terror. And so understanding that the reason why the US has focused so strongly on attacking the Cuban Revolution, on attempting to economically strangle the Cuban people, attempting to starve them to death, is precisely because a revolutionary socialist and anti-imperialist country sitting just 90 miles off the coast of the United States represents a direct challenge to US hegemony. Cuba's commitment to internationalism, to finding alternatives to the US dollar, to joining alternative economic formations like BRICS, all of these represent a challenge to US hegemony, and this is why the US has consistently attacked the Cuban Revolution. In terms of what we need to do as organizers in the anti-imperialist movement, the political strategy of getting people to travel to Cuba, to Nicaragua, to Venezuela, to other socialist and anti-imperialist countries, to get them to see for themselves what conditions are in those countries and what those movements are about, it cannot be understated. For me personally, the first time I went to Cuba in 2019 was a massive leap forward in my political consciousness. And it's not because it's exceptional or unique, it's because of how impactful going to see it for ourselves from the belly of the beast, coming from a context where we hear nothing but lies about these countries. It is a transformational experience. It gives people a giant leap forward in terms of the development of anti-imperialist consciousness. And we need to, as solidarity movements within the belly of the beast, get as many young people, poor, working class, and colonized people, people from the front lines of movements for justice in the United States, to these countries as possible. We need them to see socialism and anti-imperialism in action for themselves. We need them to build international solidarity in practice. And most importantly, we need them to learn from these revolutionary socialist and anti-imperialist countries and take those learning back to build and strengthen movements against imperialism in the United States. We need to create pressure from the inside with a conscious and organized working class, just as nations like Cuba, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua are creating pressure against imperialism from the outside. We also need to engage in political education campaigns in our community. Not everybody has the capacity to travel or the desire to travel, but we still need to be engaging in consciousness raising activities, educational events, and campaign conversations in our neighborhoods, again, with poor, working class, and colonized communities that are themselves experiencing domestic forms of sanctioned regimes. Like when we talk about cuts to social services like welfare, when we talk about cuts to social security, to food stamps, those cuts are directly targeting oftentimes diasporic populations that are being targeted by imperialism all over the world. Literally the same people that are making conditions unlivable in the United States by cutting social services, by cutting funding to our communities, are doing the exact same thing all over the world for the same reason, to attempt to inflict so much suffering that their policy objectives are taken on. So we have to help our people understand that there is no line of separation between so-called domestic issues and foreign policy issues. It is in fact the same enemy, the same ruling class that is carrying out these economic and political attacks against the same communities all over the world. The other piece about this political education campaign that's necessary is that the US ruling class has worked really hard to obfuscate its tactics, meaning most people in the United States rightfully oppose the idea of invading a foreign country and putting US boots on the ground. They understand that that's bad at this point after witnessing like 30 years of military failures from the United States. However, sanctions have been successfully sold by the US ruling class as a so-called kinder and gentler alternative to boots on the ground. We know already this is not true. We know that sanctions are designed to attack civilian populations, to bring suffering to the most marginalized segments of these population: elders, disabled people, families, women. Like these are the people that are suffering when economic sanctions are applied. But people living in the United States, for the most part, do not understand this because it's not the reality of it is hidden from them. And if they did understand it, the majority of them would oppose it. And so this is the other purpose of engaging in organized political education work in our communities, to help them understand that they themselves are being sanctioned domestically, that the same people are doing it internationally, and that's a tactic that's deliberately targeting civilians. And then also very, very important in terms of concrete next steps or ways that we need to organize ourselves strategically is that we cannot allow the situation of any individual country being targeted by imperialism through sanctions or domestic issues to be exceptionalized. What I mean by this is that we have to put attacks on Cuba, on Nicaragua, on Venezuela, on Zimbabwe, on Eritrea, on the DPRK, on all these nations being sanctioned. We have to put those attacks within the context of global imperialism. We cannot allow a movement where we say, well, we like Cuba, but Nicaragua's a dictatorship. Or we like Venezuela, but we can't rock with Cuba. It's all the same struggle. It is all countries united resisting imperialism, the front line of the global movement for the future of life on this planet, to be quite honest. So we have to understand these nations resisting in this context and not allow a single one to be isolated. We have to have that touch one, touch all mentality. So just to wrap it up, just bottom line, we need political education. We need as many people as possible traveling on these delegations. We need to make them much more accessible to many more different kinds of people to help our people understand that Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are revolutionary anti-imperialist nations who are on the front line of the global struggle against imperialism, the global struggle for justice. We have to organize to concretize these next steps around building accessible delegations, engaging in political educations, which means that if we are not active in organizations fighting for justice, we need to join organizations fighting for justice, join the organizations represented on this call, join an organization in your local area, get moving collectively. If you are in a US-based organization and you are not a member of the National Network on Cuba, we definitely can hope that you will consider joining and begin to help coalesce the Cuba Solidarity Movement, help bring it together and get us acting in more and more unity. And if you're looking for an opportunity to travel to Cuba, the next May Day Brigade, organized by the National Network on Cuba, is going to be April 26th to May 10th, and you can check out the application and more information on the NNOC website. And I just want to end by reiterating the demands of the U.S.-Cuba Solidarity Movement to ground ourselves on why we're here for Cuba. We demand the end of the U.S. blockade on Cuba, all U.S. imposed travel restrictions, and all regime change programs. We demand the end of the legal U.S. military occupation of Guantanamo Bay, and we demand that Cuba be permanently removed from the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. And I'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Onyesonwu. Wow. There was a lot in that presentation, lots of good ideas there. And I think each of the speakers actually brought up some very good points. We could use some more questions in the Q&A. So if you have a burning question, please don't hold back. Write your question in the Q&A now so that we can pose it to the speakers. I think I will just start with one. I don't believe that I heard any of the speakers say this specifically, so I'm just going to see if you have any response to this. A point was made by a couple of speakers about how sanctions actually can drive immigration or migration to the United States, which actually then is something that we should be pointing out to the U.S. Congress so that they could use that point to oppose sanctions on any country. I'm wondering whether the same kind of point could be used in terms of the effect that these sanctions are having inadvertently on the U.S. economy. Because what is happening is that sanctions on 40 countries and, possibly more to come are meaning that those countries are searching for alternative ways of building their economies, and they've joined together in economic structures like BRICS, which over the long term, I believe, are going to be self-defeating for the United States. So if you have any comments about how that point could be used with the U.S. Congress to oppose sanctions, I'd welcome them. I think otherwise, then I'll turn it over to Nan to see if she's got a question she'd like to pose.
Well, this is not really, well, here's a question. Ross Brown asks, apparently there's an amnesty report that's very critical of Nicaragua. Well, that's nothing new. Amnesty is funded by the US government, by right-wing foundations, and all of their reports since 2018 are always very critical of Nicaragua. This was raised with me accusingly and unexpectedly by a liberal friend. She's not very far left, at least in relation to global politics. She doesn't seem to recognize the iniquitous role that the USA, the military-industrial complex, and NATO play in world affairs. I haven't read Amnesty's report. What do I say to her? Because in other contexts, Palestine, for example, amnesty is helpful. Thanks. Would anyone like to respond to that question?
Well, I'll just respond briefly because I think John Perry put a link in the comments that was a direct response to this amnesty report. So if someone could put that link up again so it doesn't get lost in the shuffle, I think that's probably the first place to go. And the second point I'd add is that it took Amnesty over a year to come out and say that what was going on in Gaza is a genocide. I think they've lost a lot of credibility, as have most of these kind of human rights NGOs that have failed to say anything at all or failed to take any concrete steps regarding Gaza. So I think that also opens up an opportunity for more peoples-based solidarity movements that care about humans and human rights to show that they have more legitimacy than some of these kind of industrial and this human rights industrial complex type NGOs.
Anyone else?
I could just add, I think what Onyesonwu said, just go and see for yourself. I think that's constantly to challenge people to go and see for yourself. I find myself reminding people, just like in the 80s, there was so much disinformation. Nicaragua was supposedly a place where they were eating children, where it was one day's march to the US border, all of these fantastic stories to demonize and scare, and nothing has changed. Go and see for yourself.
And I'd add something very brief, that on the Alliance for Global Justice website, once again, if you scroll down on the right where we have a number of books and studies on Nicaragua, there is a group response led by John, a response to the Amnesty's first very negative report on Nicaragua. And their reports really haven't changed much. They just replace one issue for another. Barbara, back to you.
Okay. This question is for Jenny. Is there any indication as to at what point Nicaragua is likely to be included on the state sponsor of terrorism list? Is this included in the current proposed bill? And many thanks for your presentation.
I think there are indications that they're trying to kind of build the case to do that. And so it's something that we're watching for that could happen. I don't know that we have any gauge to know how fast or when, but it's another level of pressure that they could inflict to isolate and make solidarity more difficult, everything more difficult. So yes, that is a possibility.
Okay, Nan?
Yeah, this is an anonymous question. What are the speaker's views on the mass deportations that are happening in the US, or I would add that may happen in the US, and their effects on Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela's economies? Anyone?
I could say something, but actually, I think that Nicaragua, in the case of Nicaragua, and Nan and others should speak up, but I think Nicaragua is probably best poised to absorb people, and there are basic rights available to education, to healthcare, et cetera. Those things are in place. Food sovereignty and food security, those things are in place there. What I'm hearing, the country that's very concerned about this is Honduras. Because of the coup d'etat in 2009 that the US backed and helped to lock into power, we saw unprecedented massive waves of what we were calling at that time, forced displacement, of people fleeing that regime. To the US. And so now on New Year's Eve, President Xiomara Castro in her message spoke to the United States diplomatically saying, we hope that there can be constructive conversation about this threat of mass deportation, because if not, and if thousands and thousands of our brothers and sisters are going to be forcibly returned after fleeing a situation which the US policy helped to put in place, that Honduras would need to reconsider military cooperation with the United States, including the US occupation of the Palmarola military base. And so that's a very, yes, good for her. That's a very tense situation right now. And again, in an election year, so things are already tense. But I think for Honduras, this is, there's a lot at play here. They are aware of how stretched things are. They are recovering from 13 years of a coup government that sacked the country and eliminated a lot of rights, that put the country up for sale. And if in an election year where there are active destabilization efforts, if there's a massive return of people into the country, they're going to be very challenged and even more destabilized. So I think that's a place of concern.
Yeah, I'd add that in terms of for Venezuela, I don't think it would have a negative economic impact. In fact, I think for the past 4 or 5 years, Venezuela has had this program called Vuelta a la Patria, Return to the Nation or Return to the Homeland, in which the government has been paying for flights for migrants to return to Venezuela, flights from Peru, Ecuador, Argentina, other places. I think at some point when the Biden administration was in talks with the Maduro government, there was a talk about having some flights go from the United States under this program. So Venezuela is very poised to receive all of these migrants back. In fact, over the last week, there's been a lot of violence in eastern Colombia, and thousands of refugees have gone into Venezuela, and they've been all received by the government, and they've received social services, medical care, among other things. So I certainly is not going to have an economic impact, a negative one.
And I would add that I feel the same way about Nicaragua, that for Nicaragua, this whole parole program has really been a program to get educated people to go to the United States. So I think Nicaragua would be really happy to see a lot of people come back. And anytime there have been deportations, they've been ready and waiting and provided some support to the people. But I also have a very different point of view. I think Trump will do some of these deportations to be in good standing with his followers. However, I think there's such a great need for migrants in the States, for migrant workers. I think Trump will get a lot of pressure from the corporations, especially corporations that work in farming and factories and etc. So I don't think this is going to go on very long, but I could be wrong. Barbara, do you want to go ahead and pick another question?
Sure. Okay, this is from Kathy Hoyt. The United States signed but did not ratify the United Nations Covenant of Economic and Social Rights because the United States does not consider people to have the right to housing, food, and education. How does this affect U.S. sanctions policies? It seems that we never speak out against countries that deny economic and social rights, and with our sanctions, we contribute to the inability of sanctioned governments to comply with those rights. So whoever would like to respond to that.
Yeah, I think that's a tough question. I think you make a really good point, Catherine, in that, when we talk, and I'll just bring it back out a little bit, when we talk about human rights, or at least not we, but when the US government and people in Congress talk about human rights, they're certainly never talking about housing and food and education. And I think that's one of the ways we've tried to push back in the past in terms of saying, like, when I've gone to lobby, if I bring up the fact that Venezuela has built 5.1 million homes over the past 10 years for low income and working class folks that have been getting that basically for free or low cost, it just kind of, I get blank stares. People, staffers look at me like I'm some sort of propagandist or something. So I don't know how that can affect, our discourse on the Hill, but it certainly is useful for speaking to the public at large and to other solidarity activists, because I think that hits home. How are we going to sanction Cuba when Cuba sends doctors all over the world? How are we going to sanction Venezuela when its government is providing free housing to so many people? How are we going to sanction Nicaragua when Nicaragua is, one of the world leaders in terms of women's participation in government, for example?
Well, this question, I feel like kind of piggybacks on what you just talked about. It's from James Phillips. Would someone like to talk about the right-wing capture of the discourse on human rights that aims to confuse solidarity folks?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. And I also feel like the US, it's not just that the US backed the genocide happening in Palestine, it's that the US made it possible. Like they armed the forces, they gave the money, they gave the political cover in the United Nations in order for that genocide to happen. And really, that event should be all the evidence that's needed to recognize that it's never been about human rights. This is why the United States refused to ratify that declaration in the United Nations, because fundamentally the ruling class of the United States does not believe even the people living here have a right to food or housing. Like they do not recognize that, and they want to maintain the right to use tactics of war, including economic sanctions that deliberately target civilian populations. And so I feel like for those of us on the left, those of us in anti-imperialist movements, we cannot allow ourselves to be so easily swayed by human rights narratives that target anti-imperialist nations. Like every time someone says, is Ortega a dictator, or is Maduro a dictator, or is Diaz-Canel a dictator, just like off top, if it's coming from the West, like that should be challenged, that should be questioned. You should not allow space in your brain for that discourse, because the people making their claims about human rights are literally carrying out genocides primarily targeting children and women. Like it's not about a care for life on a basic level. It is solely a propaganda tactic to manipulate people living in the United States into isolating these countries that are being targeted by imperialism.
Well said. There is a question here which refers to barriers to fundraising for organizations that are fighting sanctions. So I'd like to kind of add to that to say that in a way is a way of, it's one more obstacle to those of us who are trying to advocate for these various countries facing sanctions, is that oftentimes the platforms will, there's a lot of pressure on fundraising platforms to stop accepting funds or donations. So I guess my question then is, are there Are there workarounds to that people have found so far? If so, please share them with the rest of us, because this is an ongoing issue, and probably we need to work together as however we can to combat it. So I welcome your ideas.
So I done two GoFundMes related to Venezuela. One was for a friend who needed an operation, and that GoFundMe was paused by the administrators for a couple of months, and it took me a long time and a lot of back and forth to get it to open up. And the other was to raise funds for an Afro-Venezuelan community center in a town called Barlovento. And that was also paused, this time for about 3 to 4 months. And in that case, they needed tax information from this organization and like a testimony that had been somehow notarized. So they put a lot of hoops, but it is possible to do those fundraisers, especially if you can show that that they don't violate the sanctions. And, sanctions for fundraising for health and for community centers absolutely do not violate those sanctions. But it's difficult. And that said, I think since we are going to face a period of at least several years of more sanctions, that this sort of fundraising and sort of offering material aid in some way, whether it's Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, is going to be more and more important. I'm reminded not just of the many fundraisers we've had for Cuba, but specifically of one we did while I was at Code Pink, where we helped to send syringes just prior to the vaccination campaign of COVID-19, because sanctions were affecting Cuba's ability to import syringes. So I think when we think about fundraising, that's something we ought to keep foremost in our minds, and sending goods to Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua over the next couple of years. And, there are going to be obstacles in our way, but we have to overcome them.
Thanks, I really appreciate it. So go ahead.
Well, here's another question about Cuba. Please talk about the dangers of the Force Act, which has already been introduced into Congress. It would codify Cuba being on the arbitrary SSOT list of countries that sponsor terrorism. Terrible for Cuba. How can we all oppose this? Thanks.
Thank you. Absolutely correct. I think the Republicans in Florida are behind that particular act, the very, very stridently anti-Cuba, anti-Castro Republicans that we have in office, unfortunately, in the state of Florida. But I think that the city council resolutions and the state level legislator resolutions that have been passed by cities and states across the United States because of the efforts of the Cuba Solidarity Movement show a path forward for how we can express our opposition to the Force Acts and similar acts of legislation that seek to further entrench U.S. antagonism towards Cuba. There's like millions of people living in the United States who are now being represented by these resolutions condemning the U.S. blockade on Cuba. And every single time we get one of those resolutions passed, whether it's in the city council, whether it's in a neighborhood organization, whether it's in a labor organization, it is an opportunity to engage more and more regular people, poor and working class people, in conversation about why this policy towards Cuba is incorrect, is unjust. The only way that we are going to successfully transform U.S. policy towards Cuba is by building an organized mass movement that is conscious of the need to end the attacks, to end the war. And so I think that we need to use the passing of those resolutions. We need to find legislators that are legislators that are winnable, that can be moved to the correct position on this, and they exist all across the United States. There's the entrenched power structure in the federal government, but all across the United States in local and state level governments, there are people who are reachable, who we can talk to about this, who will hear us, who will support these resolutions. And so that is a strategy I think that we should continue. And I just want to drop the link to the resolutions page on the NNOC website, so folks can learn more about all the different organizations and cities and states that have passed resolutions like this, and also how they can get them passed themselves in their local area.
Thank you.
Okay. We have here what is another response to the question about fundraising. So I'm just going to read it out. This is from Kathy Hoyt, and I agree with this. So I'm promoting it. Is that people can dig out their mostly unused checkbooks, but they can also use the bank payer apps or the bill payer apps that they have available to them on through their banks. They could also send money orders, et cetera, to make donations to targeted nonprofits. So it might be a bit old fashioned. We might have to revert back to that in our fundraising a little bit, but especially I recommend the bill payer app. That works well for me. Okay, let's see if there's a good question here. Could somebody respond to the question from Margot in chat? Has Daniel Ortega, become a dictator, silencing opposition, as stated by someone recently in the US newspaper? Softball question, but who would like to answer it?
I can try to answer that. I think this is part of what our education advocacy work is about, is really generating other voices and experiences and facts and documentation that undermines that narrative. And there's a lot of it if you go to the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition website. There's lots of resources there that you could use and share that really disarm those harmful narratives.
And on Nika Notes there, if you just scroll back the last number of years, there are many articles responding to that question. We need more questions.
Well, Nan, if you're not ready with a question, I could ask this one that I see here.
Okay.
Can someone speak to the particular ways that sanctions have been affecting women?
So when you think about when economic sanctions are applied upon a country, like what that looks like on the ground, right? It looks like shortages of basic necessities on a day-to-day basis. And the reality of the situation under systemic patriarchy is that women are primarily responsible for domestic responsibilities, which means that when there are shortages of food, when there are shortages of medicine, when there are shortages of basic materials needed for day-to-day life, it is the domestic labor force that feels it the most acutely. The other piece about it, though, is that the economic contraction that is caused by sanctions, the fact that the value of the currency decreases, the fact that domestic industry decreases because the companies can get the capital they need to expand to be able to pay people. All of that means that access to like good jobs, access to like basic benefits with good jobs is contracted, which means that women who are already, because of patriarchy, systematically locked out of equal representation in the labor force feel it more acutely. They're going to struggle more to find jobs than men. It's also true of elder folks. It's also true of queer and trans folks. So whenever we think about how economic sanctions impact a country, always think about how the most marginalized populations, which includes women, which includes elders, which includes disabled people, which includes queer and trans folks, they're going to feel it hardest and first. And I also know on the Sanctions Kill website, there are specific studies about North Korea, about Venezuela, and also about Zimbabwe, explaining the specific impact on women. So I'm going to pull up those links and share them in the chat.
Yeah, and on that note, I just put an Oxfam report on the chat that came out, I think, 4 years ago. It's called The Right to Live Without a Blockade, and a lot of it focuses on how women are impacted specifically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And while that focuses on Cuba, the same is true for Venezuela and Nicaragua.
Mm-hmm.
Nan?
Yeah. So Paul Fitch asked Jennifer, I guess Jennifer, you mentioned that Honduras may become a target of sanctions.
Mhm.
And if you could explain why that would be, is it because
Mhm.
they're entering into relationships with China and other countries the US government is displeased with?
Mhm. Sure, Paul. It's a combination of things. When this particular this administration took power, President Xiomara Castro, she came in with a mandate to address demands of the base, the majority, and to take certain measures. And several of them are definitely pushing back on US policy directly. One of them was to declare the establishment of ZEDES, these economic development zones, as unconstitutional. And so she did that, and that is something that the United States did not want to have happen. She has also developed sustained diplomatic relationships with China, and the US is very unhappy and uncomfortable with that as well, and has told her that repeatedly. So the direction of her government is to try to, in a very challenged situation, respond to demands for structural change from the majority of the population. And the United States does not want her going in those directions. And China is part of it, but also pushing back on certain things that the US wanted to have in place, like those ZEDES, is part of it. And now certainly with her bringing up the whole question of military cooperation, I think that will certainly be a concern for the US. And we already see evidence of this sanction. The Ingalls list was just put out, and on it, that's a list of people that the US Congress identifies as being problematic. And one Honduran was added to that list, who was a Supreme Court justice whose opinion was very much part of getting the ZEDES to be declared unconstitutional. And she was added to that list with no justification whatsoever. But that's seen as sort of an upping of the pressure to target people who are working against US policy interests. And they're anticipating that that could expand.
Thank you, Jenny.
We have a question
Yes,
from
and
Natalia.
yeah, that's a big, just one other thing. They also they just arrested a general who was trained at the School of the Americas and participated in the coup of 2009, plus two other high-ranking military officials. And they are in custody right now and will go to trial for the murder of a young man who was killed in a situation where the military was repressing civilians, unarmed, peaceful protesters. And so they are working on addressing cases, outstanding human rights cases that remain in impunity, and have captured, that's a sort of a historic event to capture a general, and that's going to go to trial.
Thanks, Jenny. We have a question from Natalia Berdinska. Do you foresee the same type of, quote, maximum pressure campaign, end quote, under the new Trump administration in its regime change strategies against Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua?
And they're saying they want to take back the Panama Canal. I feel like they made their intentions clear, very clear. So we should.
And Greenland.
Yeah, exactly. They're calling it the Gulf of America now. I will never call it that, but I guess that's happening. So to me, it seems very clear that we're returning to like out in the open Monroe Doctrine instead of under the cover Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think there is a very kind of slight possibility that things might be a little different for Venezuela if this special envoy, Richard Grenell, gets his way, in which case there might be some sort of deal. I mean, there's some speculation that a deal might look something like oil licenses for Venezuela in exchange for deportation flights, something to that effect. So maybe you wouldn't see the full return to maximum pressure. But you know, Marco Rubio is very clear about what he wants, and he wants regime change in all three countries. So if he gets his way, absolutely, we're going to see a return to this.
Mhm. Okay, so here's a question from Paul Ward. It's probably our last question because it's 3:30, 4:30 Eastern time. Has any support to any of the three countries in question today been given recently by CARICOM or any Caribbean government? Would it help very much?
So CARICOM was instrumental in voting down a proposal at the OES to send a humanitarian intervention into Venezuela in 2019, 2020. So in that sense, yes, absolutely. CARICOM has been, you know, offering a lot of support against the sanctions. The sanctions also affect them, right? Because Venezuela, prior to the sanctions, had this program called PetroCaribe, which is offering discounted oil and development programs throughout the Caribbean. And this all fell apart due to the sanctions. And so they saw their own economies impacted. So they've been very clear about wanting an end to this policy for the most part.
Anyone else? Thank you, Leonardo.
We just got another question.
Okay.
I'm kind of pushing it because we're at time right now. But if somebody has a brief response to this, excuse me. In the face of significant challenges such as propaganda, misinformation, coup attempts, sanctions, and embargoes, what do you believe is the hardest obstacle for nations like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela to overcome in their pursuit of sovereignty and development? Is it the external pressure from powerful states, the internal divisions exacerbated by misinformation, or the economic strain caused by sanctions and embargoes? And how can these countries effectively address these challenges while maintaining their independence and advancing their development goals? Oh my goodness. Well, okay, if anybody has a brief response.
I don't know about a brief response because I think that would be a webinar in and of itself. But I think, you know, things like the BRICS are becoming more and more important. And South-South cooperation. So while Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela have been suffering under sanctions, they've also been developing jointly through organizations like ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. And so this kind of an interdependence is going to be really important for these three countries and every other country that's sanctioned to work together. And I think we've seen that, specifically in the case of Venezuela. I can tell you that Iran's aid was critical in maintaining the government, let's say it that way, because Iran sent gasoline and engineers and all sorts of petrochemicals that were being blocked by sanctions to Venezuela at a point where things were very critical, where there was talk of another coup happening in 2020, and so South-South cooperation is my short answer.
Thank you. Well, we have gone past our time, and so I think at this point we should thank our speakers and thank everyone who attended this webinar. I think it was really an interesting webinar, and I want to thank the speakers for all their contributions. Two things. I think we will be sending out a link to the recording within the next 2 or 3 days, as soon as we can get that produced. But along with that, for anybody who registered for this webinar, we'll also be sending out a list of resources and ways to get involved. For example, with Americas Without Sanctions, we'll have some specific links that you can go to sign up for things and to keep active with all of us. That I think is my main comment. I'm wondering whether people then have final words, any of the speakers who might have a final word that you'd like to offer to our audience.
I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you again, Barbara and Nan and the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition for organizing this great webinar. And I want to highlight Jill's comment here about solidarity between organizations to kind of echo and mimic the solidarity that's happening already between Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua.
Absolutely, really excited that we are building stronger unity between the different solidarity movements in the United States. Also want to reiterate the call to travel to these nations. If you have the capacity to do so, or if you can help someone else get there, travel to these nations, see them for yourselves, and then come back here and spread the truth from your own eyes. And then again, I just want to plug the May Day Brigade, April 26th to May 10th. We are leading the U.S. contingent of the May Day Brigade to Cuba, and you can learn more at nnoc.org.
Yeah, I want to just thank everyone also and echo Onyesonwu's words about don't ever let this narrative and these policies isolate anyone. Don't participate in that kind of isolation. We all have to hold together. So thank you.
Okay, Nan, you want to close us out?
Well, just thanks to everyone, our speakers, everyone who has spent the afternoon here with us. I think we learned a lot. And I will say that last question was a great one. I wish we'd had more time to talk about that one. So go forth, all of you, and do all your good work.
Okay, bye for now. Thanks for coming, and we will be sending more information to you very shortly.